Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Sorry for the brief hiatus. It was not intentional, just had some guests cancel, some personal life things come up, but we're back at it. After the Ukrainian drone attack on Russia, I had to get Sim on the podcast as quickly as possible because I have been very spun up on this. And Sim was a nice, sober corrective. He told me some of the ways that I was right to feel this way, but also was like, "Hey, Jacob, like rein it back a little bit. It's not like fundamentally earth-shattering either." So, hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. I always learn so much when I talk to Sim and folks of his ilk. You can write to me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns, etc. about the podcast. Otherwise, we've got a full slate of guests coming up for this month. So buckle your seatbelts. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Sim, it's been too long since you were on the podcast, which, by the way, I think reflects the general level of fatigue around the Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing war. Like, even I have gotten fatigued by some of the news around it. And so we haven't had you on recently to check in. And then lo and behold, last week, the Ukrainians pull a real rabbit out of their hat. They attack Russia with over 100 drones. The reporting I've seen, the drones cost a couple $100 per drone. And they destroy somewhere between, I don't know, a fourth and a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Like, those are some of the statistics that I've seen. And for me, it made me sit up in my chair too, and rethink, the global military balance of power. What does this mean for great conventional powers versus asymmetric attacks from smaller powers that are next to them? It's hard not to think of the Israeli attack on Hezbollah with the pagers, and it's hard not to think of the Houthis just chilling there in Yemen, like still bombing whatever they want to bomb, even though Biden and Trump have both tried to scare them and bomb them into submission. So I wanted to have you on to ask you, we could talk about, and I'm sure we will get into sort of the tactical aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war, because even with this massive Ukrainian success, it doesn't look like things are going particularly well for Ukraine. And Russia's been using drones to its own, great effect on their side and seizing territory from Ukraine. But tell me, as somebody who follows this stuff much more granularly than I do, was it a similar oh shit moment for you, or was it like, yeah, this is like it's a higher value target. Like, they upped the ante a little bit, but this is what we've been seeing for years, and this is continue to be the future of war. So, take that whatever direction you want, and we can dive into what all this means.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me again. So, on the attack itself, I think it definitely stands out as an anomalous operation, right? Both in the way that it was set up and the effects that it achieved. So it's, we've seen a lot of back and forth attacks with drones, but not quite like this, right? Not these type of targets, not this type of simultaneous reach across Russia. One big thing maybe to start at, to address, is you were mentioning you've seen a lot of those statistics, numbers being thrown around. Initially, I think the Ukrainian SBU was claiming 41 aircraft destroyed. Mm-hmm. People making calculations, that's this percentage of the strategic fleet, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, one of the first things that I've been doing, one of the things I've been looking at for the past week is the satellite imagery coming out of those different bases that were struck, right, or allegedly struck, because there were 5 air bases inside Russia that were initially mentioned, 4 main ones where there were some indications that strikes had actually taken place. So the interesting thing is that, at least in satellite imagery, we can only observe damage to aircraft in 2 of those air bases. The other air bases might have been attacked. I can't rule that out, but there's no indications of that. There's no visible damage to aircraft. There's no burnt down plots of grass or foliage, as we see at the other places where the explosives set that off. So, that's the first kind of dampener on just the scale of this operation, or at least the scale of its success. Second to that is when we look at those 2 airfields where there was actually damage observed, the number of aircraft that was destroyed gets nowhere near the number of 41 that Ukrainian sources initially alleged. I think all combined, we've got 11 aircraft that were completely destroyed. Seven, I'm just going to check the numbers, make sure I'm saying the right thing. But yeah, 7 Tu-95 Bear bombers, and then 4 Tu-22, which are the jets versus the Bear, which are the big kind of B-52-ish looking aircraft. So 4 Tu-22s, and then there's 2 additional Tu-22s. One that in satellite imagery we can see it was at least damaged to one of the wings, not completely destroyed. And then there's another Tu-22 that was likely critically damaged based on some of the videos that the Ukrainians put out. So there's one aircraft that's not among the others that we could see in satellite imagery, where you can see some distinct damage behind the cockpit to the fuselage, which likely makes it in a critical condition, needing some very serious repairs, if not a full write-off. So, all combined, we're talking about about 13 of these bombers, these strategic bombers, that are out of action, at least. Now, one big caveat is, there might be damage to some other bombers that wasn't easily observed in satellite imagery, that wasn't proven in the videos. So there might be additional damage, but that number of 13 is already several degrees lower than the 41 and the huge percentages of that bomber fleet. Even in those individual air bases, there were many more aircraft that were not hit than that were hit, right? So that's just an important thing. So when people are talking about what this means for the nuclear balance of power in the world, obviously this has some effect, but I don't think that this is a qualitative shift where Russia's nuclear deterrent is suddenly inoperable because of the loss of these aircraft, right? I also don't think that something that a lot of people have been talking about online is the potential threat to U.S. strategic bombers from similar type of drone attacks. I also don't think that that this attack necessarily shows that bombers are extremely weak, or that we need to completely rethink how bombers fit into the nuclear triad and things like that. So I think there's a lot of big talk, big reactions to a very exciting operation. But I think as things calm down, we haven't strayed too far from the norm.
Okay, that's a good sober corrective. Let's dive into a little bit more, because I want to talk about the U.S. bombers and the nuclear deterrent and everything else, and I have questions about that. But let's talk about just the nature of the attack itself. So taking your point that at least what we know based on the satellite imagery and the data that you've been able to gather, maybe not as big an attack as what the Ukrainians said. But is the quality of, even if it was only 2 bases, and even if it is only 13, strategic bombers, that's 13 more than they were able to bomb this entire war so far. Is this a qualitative shift in the ability of smaller powers to attack larger powers? Does this give Ukraine some kind of long range like strike capability that it didn't have before? Or to your point, is this really just like, hey, like the fact that they have lowered the numbers suggests that this is just relatively normal? It seems not normal to me, because I can't think of Ukraine being able to do, if even a quarter of what they've claimed is true, that seems like a big deal to me. Are you saying that, well, even that's not that big of a deal, or are you sort of correcting down from the numbers but saying, no, this still represents a transformative moment in the history of war?
I don't believe it's a transformative moment, because this threat has existed, right? We have seen similar kinds of drone attacks. I think it was 2008, 2009 when we had those alleged assassination drones targeting Maduro in Venezuela. We've seen Israel use these kind of quadcopter explosive laden drones for attack. So the idea of using these kind of drones to attack military targets is definitely not new. What stands out about this operation is how close they managed to get inside Russia, far behind enemy lines, because that's where these bombers live, right? They sit at airfields that are nowhere near the front line, so your other systems with more limited range cannot get there. I mean, these drones themselves have fairly limited range. You physically have to get next to the airport to be able to conduct these strikes. So what sets this operation apart is the nature of it as an intelligence operation, right? It's the infiltration of Russia. It's the preparation of the equipment. A lot of people talking about the wooden boxes on the trucks, etc. It's that kind of intelligence operation that allowed Ukraine to get close to the airfields and then strike them simultaneously, which is an important element because that starts to go into repeatability of an attack like this. Why do you strike all these airports or air bases at the same time? Because you know you might only get one shot, right? Once you conduct an attack like that, Russia is aware of this kind of operation. They're going to be on alert, looking for Ukrainian infiltrants inside Russia, trucks showing up near air bases, things like that. So doing the exact same thing over again is probably going to be more difficult in the future. And that, I think, is also the key reason why I don't see it as a transformative event in the way war is conducted, because these kind of one-off creative clandestine or intelligence operations, whatever you want to call it, you're always going to have those in war. They're the product of creative approaches to real problems. But if something is not a threat or a capability that is sustainable, I don't think it really reshapes the battlefield. And that's the big thing here, where yes, it's great for Ukraine that they were able to take out these aircraft, and these aircraft, apart from being part of Russia's strategic force, of course, were also very much engaged in launching precision missiles into Ukraine, into Western Ukraine, etc. So there's a very direct reason for Ukraine to want to take out these airplanes. And so their success is definitely not meaningless, but I think in the longer term, this capability or this operation does not deny Russia the use of those bombers for the duration of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to get to Ukrainian. We'll put a pin in that because we'll come back to Ukrainian intentions and the timing of this and all those other things. But I want to push a little bit more on the nature of this attack, because you raised, Israel using drones. Okay, but Israel is going after, non-state militias, maybe sort of sclerotic, authoritarian Arab regimes when it has those drones. Maduro, like some drones going after a single guy. This is, going after a country's conventional air force and striking a meaningful blow against a country's conventional air force. So in that way, it seems like a huge escalation. But I can hear you saying to me, okay, but that's just a difference in degree, Jacob. But let me give you a tangible example to sort of test what you're saying. One of the things I've sort of taken for granted for, I don't know, over a decade now, since you and I were together at Stratfor, I've taken for granted that Israel could never really strike Iran's nuclear capability because it was just too far away. Like their planes couldn't get there. They would need help refueling, or they would need they would need the United States or some other actor to help make a strike realistic. And it wasn't clear that any actor was going to support them. And if they were, you were going to see those actions before it happened. So it wasn't going to be that big of a secret. Could that change? Like, can Israel use these drones that you've been talking about not to just wipe out parking lots in the Gaza Strip, but to go after Iran's nuclear program? Because that's where then that would be a sort of change in the capability of a nation to conduct war, if it is. Or is this like, well, not unless, Jacob, they have the Mossad on the ground having recruited Iranians who are actually controlling the things and doing the things. So you would need the intel operation in order to pull it off, and maybe you only get one shot. So react to that example for me.
So they have done that, not necessarily with these same kind of drone attacks, but that has been a massive part of Israel's efforts to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And I'm thinking specifically of the attacks against Iranian nuclear scientists. So there's been, I can't even think of the exact dates, but by the time we met at Stratfor, it was already ongoing for years. But I don't know if you remember those operations, like where they use a remote controlled gun in the back of an SUV to target a vehicle that was driving by. A real action movie type intelligence operation. Um, so that stuff happens, and Israel is definitely leaning on that, especially at times when they don't have that conventional ability to just go in and wipe everything out. I would say more recently we have seen another major change, which is the complete disappearance of the Syrian air defense network due to events that occurred in Syria, and that Israel very swiftly exploited to take out anything remotely air defense capable inside Syria, because now this actually does leave Israel with a large an open flight route from Israel towards Iran that it didn't have before. By which I mean to say, like yes, conditions change, right? Things change. So as operations by Mossad inside Iran occur, maybe they do get experience from this, and they are able to launch some kind of drone-based attack against these facilities. But where all of that eventually comes back, and I'm going to link it to another element of our days at Stratfor, when we used to have the guys in the tactical team talk about the attack cycle. Remember that? Like the whole, you start with surveillance, your preparation, etc., before the actual attack. So there's a lot of components that take place before, in those cases we're talking about terrorist attacks, but I think the attack cycle looks very similar when we're talking about Israeli operations inside Iran or Ukrainian operations inside Russia. And I think that's where Russia really dropped the ball in these cases. The fact that Ukraine was able to get these systems assembled inside Russia, was able to deploy them near air bases, was able to scout those air bases. That's where you would normally have expected them to have gotten caught or discovered, right? And that's why when we're talking about the risk of similar kind of attacks against Western air bases in the US and other NATO countries, I would expect and I would hope that security procedures are much, much tighter, and that if you start to drive around an airbase that hosts B-2 bombers multiple times in a short time frame, you would probably get pulled over and you'd have some really tough questions to answer. Same thing with a truck suddenly appearing. My assumption would be that there is very active scanning for objects appearing that don't belong in the areas of these strategic facilities. I think those are all types of things that are less ingrained in the kind of Soviet-style security services in Russia. So maybe that exposes them a little more to this kind of attack. But then as that attack happens, of course, that also means that the next time you try to hit those bombers, you're going to have to do it slightly differently. So it becomes another new creative intelligence operation that you have to set up, and you might succeed, but I think that still makes it like a one-off type of attack rather than, we're able to actually suppress that capability on the Russian side.
I think you're a little too sanguine, at least in the United States, about the thoroughness of the security here. I mean, we're talking about a country that just a couple months ago accidentally fired a bunch of the employees that were supposed to be working on nuclear safety and then tried to hire them back. I don't know if you've seen the picture of this 22-year-old who is now apparently being tasked with heading up the Center for Prevention Programs at DHS. So like one of the primary like U.S. departments for going after terrorism. was working. I mean, no offense to those working in grocery stores, but he was in a grocery store a year ago, and his picture, like if I was a terrorist and I'm looking at this picture on the Department of Homeland Security's website, I would be like, cool, like probably security's not so good here. But in any case, I think though in your response, like yes, Israel has assassinated Iranian scientists by car bombs and some of these other ways, but could Israel knock out Iranian air defense with a coordinated, huge, massive drone strike? Could it take out a nuclear facility with drones? Like that's the sort of leap. And I guess I'll let you respond to that, but another sort of test example for what you're talking about, and this is one that I think has gotten a lot of currency, and I'm curious to hear what your response is. I mean, I'm on record as saying I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. But let's say there's a naval conflict in the South China Sea, and China's on one side and the United States is on the other side of it. The United States, like key to its naval power is its aircraft carriers. Does using drones in this sort of manner basically just make the carriers sitting ducks? Like I'm not thinking really about that the Chinese are going to use drones to attack U.S. Air assets inside of the United States. But if you're in the South China Sea and you've got 3 carriers deployed, what at this point makes those carriers anything but sitting ducks for massive drone attacks from the Chinese? Like that seems another way in which this completely transformed the balance of power in a conflict that we could imagine.
I mean, that's a very good use case, and there's actually a very good recent example on the use of drones in kind of a conventional setting outside of Ukraine. But one of the big things I want to say is when I'm saying that this attack by Ukraine is not a transformative event, that doesn't mean that the drones by themselves are not transformative in warfare, right? I just don't think that this event is the big unveiling of a new capability that changes things. But you're absolutely right. The existence of these small drones and growing capabilities in coordinating these drones with other types of operations, using swarms, etc., things that have been theorized and talked about and practiced for decades, but that are now becoming more practical knowledge as they're being executed on the battlefields, right? I do believe that is a big difference and a big threat to any warfighter out there. Now, the example I wanted to mention is that in the current kind of simmering troubles between Pakistan and India, there was actually an incident recently that I heard from some people where Pakistan used a number of regular civilian drones without armaments or anything, no explosives involved, to go and harass Indian forces as a distraction. So they were literally just flying drones into Indian troops and into their positions to keep them occupied while actually executing other operations at the same time. So even something as simple as that, when you're talking about Israel leveraging this to suppress or destroy Iranian air defenses, or China leveraging it to let's say distract the defenses of a U.S. carrier group, I think that's very feasible. The question is how are you actually going to conduct it? There's a lot of ways that you can approach that. Obviously, these drones themselves don't have the range to go from mainland China to wherever a U.S. carrier group might be hanging out at open seas. But let's assume the Chinese are launching these drones from somewhere in the water. Maybe they're even carrying them all the way there in unmanned surface vessels, which another thing that we've seen really growing in importance in Ukraine, the way that Ukraine has used those kind of vessels to even take down aircraft from open sea. So people are using these remote operated platforms or even autonomous platforms in really creative ways, and obviously that is going to change a lot about the ways that wars are fought. And I don't think there's even a limit to that. But I think that just becomes an overall part of the technological evolution of warfare, right? And it's not necessarily specifically targeted against those strategic assets like the nuclear bombers. It's a more general evolution of the level of technology that your standard warfighter is employing.
Yeah,
Does that make sense? I
it
feel like I
does.
went
Well,
on a little bit of a rant.
no. You're literally here to go on rants. That's the whole point. Um, uh, okay. Well, one last example I want to throw at you, and then I want to get into some of the. Well, actually, there's two more conceptual questions I want to ask you, and then we'll get into some of the specifics about Russia, Ukraine. We talked about Israel, Iran. It sounds to me like your answer to China, Taiwan was, yeah, actually, this does shake up how you would think about a conflict in the South China Sea. Correct me if I'm wrong. You talked about India, Pakistan, and using its distraction. There's also, and this is the one where it starts to get very dystopian, um, where this now empowers non-state actors in a way that pre-drones they wouldn't necessarily have had that power. I'm thinking specifically about Mexico, but you can imagine other examples where you have groups like cartels who exist outside of the government, and who have problems with the government. Does this now give them some kind of capability to go after the conventional assets of the military of the country that they're in? The cartels have used drones already for assassinations and for attacks in far-flung areas and some of their turf wars and things like that, even attacks on local police. But you haven't seen a Mexican cartel say go after like a Mexican military garrison or after a Mexican strategic air asset or something like that, in part because the conflict hasn't gotten there yet. But does this, like, if you are a country where you have a non-state actor or you have a rebel group or something like that, does this even the balance of power in some meaningful way? Like, should now, like, can a cartel or a militant group in some country in the world like take this playbook and strike the conventional capacity of the government that they're going against, or am I reaching too far there?
Again, I think all the things that you're saying all are correct, except for that one little part, the this now part, right? Where I
Mm-hmm.
think all of this has been the case for over a decade. We've seen the use of these kind of drones emerge and grow and become more professional over the course of the Syrian civil war, Islamic State operations in both Syria and Iraq. Um, and from there, it has spanned out to the rest of the world. Ukraine has been another kind of big uplift in the level of those capabilities. But we've also seen that kind of the adaptation of those same kind of drones in places like Sudan, um, Mexico, as you mentioned, the cartels using those kind of drones. I think that capability is well known and being adopted by anyone that that is trying to grasp at any means they can to try and gain an advantage over their opponents. And I think it's not even just an asymmetric warfare element where um, even conventional forces, and Ukraine being the big example of that, even conventional forces or the stronger actors in a conflict even want to adopt these kind of technologies because they're just so damn effective. Um, and in Mexico, I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen them go after air bases or to sink the Mexican Navy is because those assets simply aren't what's troubling the cartels, right? You want to focus your efforts against the things that you're actually being troubled by. Now, I would say if we go all the way back to um, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, I remember them using drones to attack Syrian air assets, for example. Um, of course, Syria doesn't have nuclear bombers, but still taking down attack helicopters. Well, not taking down, but destroying attack helicopters on the ground, destroying fighter aircraft on the ground. That was a pretty big win for them. Um, but I would also add to that I don't remember any incidents where the Islamic State was able to target coalition air bases in the same way, because obviously those coalition air bases were much farther removed spatially from the battle space, had different levels of security than the Syrian one. So I think that's kind of um, the struggle, or I guess the balancing that is happening, right? Where on the one hand you have this capability, these drones, but it's also limited in range and access, and then you can actually set up security procedures against it. There's also a lot of counter drone weaponry these days. Some of it focusing on detecting these drones early, some of it focusing on disrupting the communications, disrupting control of these drones. And that actually kind of points to some of the interesting elements in that whole arms race as well, where in Ukraine you see evolutions towards the use of fiber optic commanded drones, where the drones are actually leaving a string of fiber optic that connects them to the controller, because then they can't be jammed or they're not detected by electronic warfare equipment. And then, as we saw in the attack against the Russian air bases, where allegedly these drones targeted the aircraft purely based on AI training. So they were, at least that's the story going around, that they were trained on images of these bombers and kind of self-targeted bombers that matched the ones they were trained to target, which is feasible for sure. But that dependence on AI is also a way to cut off external communications and dependencies. It means that if your navigation, your targeting is computed within the drone, you don't have to rely on a radio signal in and out of the drone to conduct your operation. So again, that cuts off that potential line of defense in terms of electronic detection or jamming. So I think it's a really fascinating arms race, because it's kind of niche technology going up against each other. And that's why when we're talking about these potential future scenarios where a US carrier group might face these kind of drone-based challenges, we also have to think about how is the US Navy preparing for those kind of threats. I would imagine they're very actively investing time and resources into detecting those kind of drones, jamming those kind of drones, kinetically taking out those kind of drones. So it's difficult to say just because they exist, they are a threat, right? The counter threat might also already have been developed.
Yeah, you sort of anticipated my next question, which is how do you defend against these things? Like, is there already going to be technology that makes this advantage moot? And is that the sort of technology that only, someone with an advanced conventional capability is going to have? I mean, the flip side of this, though, is, this is where it does feel asymmetric. And here the example of Israel, we're always going to come back, I think, to examples of Israel, Yemen, Ukraine, Russia, because this is where war is happening. But Iron Dome and Israel's missile defense system, developed in cooperation with the United States, incredible success rates, but also like extremely expensive. Like the Iranians showed this, where they can, pop off relatively cheap rockets, exhaust the supply of the missile defense system, and then eventually you're going to run out of money and you're going to run out of the counters. So I don't know, maybe somebody will invent some type of technology. Maybe you can send out an EMP pulse or something in one direction. Like now we're getting really science fiction oriented, but is there a way to defend against these things? Or are we going to see a whole industry of how to defend against drones in general? Yeah, take that however you want.
I mean, that industry already exists, and it's definitely pumping out revenue. But
it's pumping out product, though.
Well, yes, I think it is. But there's also a lot of solutions that are not necessarily entirely focused on this new threat. So you have these companies pushing these anti-drone guns, right? Like the futuristic looking ray guns that you aim at the drone and it gives a very concentrated beam to jam the signal effectively. But let's not forget that the whole electronic spectrum of warfare is not exactly something new. That's something that's been going on since the 60s, 70s, when the use of various kinds of radars and jamming and all of those things has only grown. So kind of as an example of that, one of the things that Ukraine has also been doing to save on kinetic interceptions, because as you mentioned with Iron Dome, that's one of the reasons that the system is so damn expensive, because those interceptors are one use by definition, or single use. So one of the things that Ukraine has been doing is using the F-16s that it got from European partners to jam the Iranian Shahed drones that Russia fires at them. So instead of kinetically targeting, they will target some of them kinetically. Obviously, there's a lot of them to take down, but they also use the electronic warfare equipment on the F-16 to jam it so that the drone, either loses its navigation, goes down, or turns back, or whatever they do based on how exactly they're affected. So that's another way that you can kind of limit the resources, because electronic warfare is relatively cheap in the sense that it doesn't require ammunition, right? It requires powering, of course. You need to acquire these systems, and the systems themselves surely aren't cheap, but there's no big logistical train for the production of advanced missiles and things like that. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of focus on that electronic jamming component of fighting drone threats. But of course, there's a lot of ways that the drones themselves are being hardened against electronic warfare. And I mentioned the fiber optics, which of course is still limited in range. You can only carry so heavy a spool of fiber optics, and that'll only have a limited length that you can achieve. The AI systems might, not have that range restriction, but then at the end of the day, how complex of an operation can you conduct purely on like pre-programmed, pre-trained behavior without risking, either mission failure or collateral damage and things like that. So there's these pretty big trade-offs. I think one of the other things that we don't see a lot about today, I'm sure it is being experimented with in a lot of these war zones, but another way to combat that kind of jamming is directional communications, using lasers or antennas that are very specific about where they're able to receive signal from, so that it's any signal that comes in from other directions is shielded out. So there's a lot of things going on there, and I'm not sure whether we can make a guess about which side will win out. Will it be the drone threat cannot be tamed, or the defenses will be so effective that it becomes completely irrelevant? I think right now we're in that phase where everybody is so actively exploring it and pushing it as far as they can, that the two are kind of constantly in balance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to all these things, there's a balance. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more specifically about Russia, Ukraine. I take your point about is this going to lead to the attack of U.S. strategic bombers? Probably not. Is this going to deter Russia's nuclear deterrent, or limit Russia's nuclear? Excuse me. Is this going to limit Russia's ability to have a nuclear deterrent or to have nuclear strike capability? No, I thought that was pretty sensationalist. The more I think specific question, and the one I don't have clarity on, is does this meaningfully impact the operations of the Russian Air Force? Does this mean that the Russian Air Force is going to be less capable of attacking or bombing Ukraine in the future? Are the security checks and protocols that Russia is going to have to put in to protect from Ukraine, is that going to create supply chain havoc, or is that going to limit the capacity of Russian air power to respond to future attacks? Can Ukraine spoof a bunch of attacks in the future? Just send shit across the border and see if they can spin things up and make them constantly guessing about what's going on. So I take your points on the bigger ones, but is there a tangible impact on Russian air power in any way, whether that's capacity to do bombing runs or how they think about future operations?
So yeah, there's definitely an impact. And I don't think the impact's necessarily in terms of the collective capacity that Russia can muster, but it's imposing a lot of additional tail to these operations. By tail, I mean like the force protection element of their air operation. So one part of that, as you mentioned, they'll have to contribute more resources to securing those airfields, even though they're far away from Ukraine. Russia cannot afford to leave them unprotected, and that's another field of activity where they cannot just draw people away and push them to the front in Ukraine. That it means you're actually going to have people there to protect the air bases. In addition to that, something that's already been happening because of other attacks against Russian air assets, not so much the big heavy bombers, but against airfields closer to the front line, is that Russia has been forced to disperse its air assets, right? So the less aircraft you keep at one single base, the more you spread them out, the more difficult you make it for Ukraine to destroy a lot of aircraft in a single attack. And actually, Russia's already been doing that with their strategic bomber fleet for quite some time during the Ukraine conflict, because there have been other attempts in the past to target them, like at Engels Air Base, where they've launched the long range drones to target the air base. So they're constantly trying to play a game of cups, where they're moving their bombers around, they're moving their fighter aircraft around to try and make it as difficult as possible for Ukraine to target them. But at the same time, that is raising a cost on Russia's behalf, right? Because on the one hand, your flight crews are constantly adapting to new locations that they're operating from. The logistics support for all of those operations has to constantly be rerouted. So after the attacks against the Russian airfields, one of the first things that we saw appearing were aircraft to transport equipment and personnel out of these bases to other bases where they will now be basing some of these bombers. But all of those constant air bridges inside Russia, those are also taking a toll on Russia's capabilities, because there's the cost of the operations themselves and fuel, man hours, however you want to express it. But the increased level of operations, the increased tempo of these kind of flights also means that there is a higher potential for accidents. Russia tends to not have the best reputation when it comes to aviation safety, and any kind of additional stress, additional flights that are required, that only increases the potential of Russian aircraft going down without Ukrainian intervention. Those are just a couple examples that I'm pulling out. But in general, yes, these kind of attacks, they are putting a constant force protection stress on the Russian military, and Russia can decide to deal with that in two ways. They can either commit to that, and that means there's less resources that they could otherwise have pushed to the front line, or they can decide to ignore it and prioritize that front line, but then essentially expose some of their more strategic assets to those kind of threats.
Mm-hmm. Which gets to the question of, and this is always the question when it comes to when it comes to these things, why did Ukraine, you think, decide to do this now? They've been planning this for 18 months. They said the situation does not, correct me if I'm wrong, does not appear to be going so well on the battlefield. They're getting, yes, they have Europe more in their corner, but the United States is not what it was even 6-8 months ago in terms of support. Trump is very, very different than Biden, so the diplomatic picture looks a lot more complicated. I take your point that they're going to put pressure on Russia, but they also are putting pressure on Russia to respond in a way that is extremely meaningful, which might open up a whole Pandora's box there too. So should we see this as a sign of Ukrainian strength? Do you think that they saw some sort of political moment where now is a time that if they did this, they could push towards negotiations from a favorable position? Should we read it as Ukrainian weakness, as a sign of desperation, that they're losing things on the front lines and they felt the need to push back or punch back in any sort of way to either prove to themselves or to their allies that they could continue forward? How do you evaluate the timing of, or the answer also could just be because they could, they wanted to do it. So if you're fighting war, you pull the levers, it's not so strategic all the time. But what do you think about the timing of this?
I think it's very difficult to draw conclusions from the timing, because there's so many different factors that could be at play here. One of them is simply, that preparation for that operation. Were they just ready and they launched it as soon as they could before potentially being discovered? Was there a risk of discovery, and did they prematurely launch it before everything went completely out the window? Or, as you mentioned, was there some kind of political initiative where it's like, hey, this operation's been on the books, it's ready to go, now's a good time? I have no idea. And I don't think I could, in any kind of useful way, speculate about it. But I think
then speculate about it in a non-useful way. That's also good too for me.
Sorry, well, let me try to pull it in a maybe in another useful direction, which is, instead of trying to think about the intent of the timing, we can talk about the impact of the timing, right? Where, like as you mentioned, the conflict in Ukraine itself has kind of stagnated. A lot of people losing interest. Ukraine has that European support, but I think one of the big things about that European support is that we've seen it also kind of evolve to want to align with Trump's ambitions when it comes to Ukraine. So I feel like a lot of the conversations between Europe and Ukraine have started to be about security guarantees once that hypothetical ceasefire is in action. There are, of course, still discussions going on about supporting Ukraine and actions going on to support Ukraine during the actual fighting, short of such a ceasefire. There's no real big qualitative shifts in that. I mean, there is the discussion with Germany about unleashing the Taurus missiles, which would give Ukraine another, long-range precision weapon that they can launch into Russia. But I also don't think that that's really going to turn the tide of the war or anything like that. The reality is that the war has evolved to a point where the lines on the ground are very static. Russia continues to push a lot of resources into the front line, and they continue to make gains. But in a positive sense, and I think we've talked about that in previous podcasts where Russia kept advancing, but Ukraine was kind of not doing its due diligence in setting up additional defensive lines behind their current positions, which caused them to, quickly have to give up terrain and then not necessarily do any better after withdrawing. So that's something that we've seen change. So since the beginning of this year, around February, March, we've seen some really impressive defensive preparations behind the front lines on the Ukrainian side, which I think also signals Ukraine's current position, right? Dealing with Trump, with Europe, everybody's talking about this ceasefire. I think they're also being realistic in understanding, like, hey, we're not going to get into a position where we get the level of support that allows us to quickly break through and take all this territory back. But if they can stabilize the front line, if they can achieve some kind of ceasefire, and if Europe and the US come through with all the security guarantees that they've been talking about, I think that's a scenario that Ukraine is more and more looking more and more positively at. And then they're putting the preparations in place by creating those defenses. Meanwhile, on the Russian end of things, even though Russia continues to gain ground slowly but surely, they are still paying heavy prices. We've seen the impact on the Russian economy over time, which has not really gotten better. We've seen Russia trying to replace some of the arms production with supplies from North Korea, which hasn't really helped. We've seen them bringing in North Korean troops. I think that happened after we last spoke, or maybe around the time we last spoke. I forgot. But, those came and went, and that hasn't really made a big difference. So Russia is trying to really muster all it can to keep the war going. They're not in a position right now where they want to accept a ceasefire in these positions, because obviously they still want to try and use the current advances they're making to bully Ukraine and or the West into achieving a higher political goal. We're kind of like what they started the war for, but never realistically could achieve.
Mhm.
So anyway, in that entire situation, that's kind of a long-winded sketch of the current situation. But if you're looking at that situation and then you see this attack occurring against the Russian strategic bomber fleet, that's one of those elements where Ukraine can still have an impact beyond simply digging in on the front line, and that at the very least has a big visual impact on Russia. So it's another one of those stressor events that puts stress internally in Russia on the government, because the appearance of, the government is messing up the approach to this conflict. We're going to waste our nuclear deterrent over this little patch of land in Ukraine. All of those ideas start to put stress on the Russian government. Of course, this is a limited amount of stress compared to the whole full spectrum of stress that they're under. But I think that's where I would kind of place this operation. It's one of those things where Ukraine can still reach out and try to have a visible impact on Russian regime stability. And I think they'll continue to try and do those kind of things. It probably won't be the same type of operation, probably not the same type of target. But that's probably one of the big tools that they have without capabilities to actually reshape the battlefield on the ground.
I'm not sure whether all this makes me feel better or worse, Sim, but I definitely feel like I know more, and that is the point of all of this at the very end. So I could talk to you for another hour, but unfortunately, I have to wrap it here. But we will not wait another 6 months to have you back on. We'll have you on extremely soon, I think, because I didn't even get to ask you how the heck the Houthis made problems for the F-35s, because I've read the Wall Street Journal reporting, and all of it just doesn't make sense to me. But let's not open that can of worms right now. We'll leave the listeners wanting more. Thanks for making the time. And it looks like, listeners, you can't see this, but there's a very nice collection of liquor behind your left. Looks like you're primed for a good weekend.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping it lasts longer than the weekend, though.
Yeah. You only live once. Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob, S-H-A-P, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.